"You're trespassing. Step away from community property immediately," she said, and man, you should have seen the look in her eyes. It was that cold, brittle kind of stare that only comes from someone who spent way too much time staring at spreadsheets and not enough time looking at the horizon. I was standing on the dirt of the Blackwood Ridge Ranch, land my family has sweated over since 1952, and I just pulled in from an 18-month deployment with the Army Corps of Engineers. Dust still thick on my boots, my duffel bag tossed in the back of a pickup that had seen better days, and my heart just wanting a quiet moment to listen to the wind through the pines. But instead of quiet, I got a spotless white Mercedes blocking my own damn gate, and a woman named Victoria Sterling, the self-appointed president of the Highlands HOA, already on the phone with 911, reporting me like I was some common thief trying to break in her gated paradise. She had no idea that her one phone call was about to pull the pin on a legal grenade that would eventually level her entire organization. And by the time the dust settled 5 minutes later, her precious HOA would be nothing but a memory in the county records office. Blackwood Ridge isn't just a piece of property to us. It's a living thing. 300 acres of Texas hill country with limestone bluffs and a creek that's never run dry, even in the worst droughts of the 70s. My grandfather, Silas Blackwood, bought this land when it was nothing but scrub brush and rattlesnakes, and he built our legacy with a handshake and a rusted-out tractor. I grew up here learning how to survey land before I could drive, and understanding that in the Army, just like on the ranch, precision is the only thing that keeps you alive. When Highlands development started creeping up our eastern fence line 3 years ago, we tried to be good neighbors, we really did. We ignored the construction noise and the way the city lights started drowning out the stars. But then came Victoria. She moved into the biggest house in the subdivision, a massive limestone monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and she decided that the aesthetic of a working cattle ranch was bringing down the property values of her manicured lawns and infinity pools. I'd been home for less than an hour when she made her first move, but the war had been brewing the whole time I was overseas. While I was coordinating infrastructure projects in a combat zone, Victoria was busy filing complaints with the county, claiming our livestock was an environmental hazard, and our barn was an unauthorized industrial structure, I walked toward her that afternoon, my hand resting on the original deed my grandfather had signed decades before her subdivision was even a thought, and I just watched her smile. That sharp, pitying smile people give you when they think they've already won. "You don't belong here anymore, Mr. Blackwood," she told me, her voice dripping with that fake, pharmaceutical rep sweetness that makes your skin crawl. "The world has changed while you were away, and we have standards now. This isn't some lawless frontier, it's a community." I just stood there, letting the sirens get closer, looking at the scratches on my grandfather's gatepost where someone had tried to pry off the original brass plaque. It was personal now. Victoria had spent the last year trying to turn the neighborhood against us, sending letters to the new homeowners claiming our ranch runoff was poisoning their children's play areas, and that my, military background, made me a volatile threat to the quiet of the ridge. She even hired a private surveyor, a guy in crisp khakis who'd never stepped in cow manure in his life, to, remap, the boundary, claiming our access road was actually part of their common area. They were trying to choke us out, cutting off the only way in or out of the ranch so they could force a sale and turn our pastures into phase 2 of their luxury hellscape. But the thing about being an Army engineer is that you learn how to read the terrain better than the people who built it. I spent the next week buried in the county archives, fueled by black coffee and a burning need for justice, digging through dusty maps and clerical records that hadn't oppos been touched since the 80s. And that's when I found it. The ace of spades, buried in a 1986 land transfer error. Back then, the county had attempted to widen the main road, but the paperwork was botched. They had accidentally listed a 50-acre slice of our property as, surplus public land, and that was the exact land the developer had bought to build the Highlands. The kicker was that because the county never actually held a legal title to our land, they couldn't oppos legally sell it. And because the developer didn't oppos actually own the land they built on, every single structure they'd erected, including the HOA clubhouse, the gated entrance, and the fancy stone walls Victoria was so proud of, was technically sitting on Blackwood property. The next morning, I was back at the gate, but this time I wasn't in Oppos, T alone. I had Silas, my old ranch foreman who's been with us since I was a kid, and a flatbed truck loaded with heavy-duty construction fencing. We started post-holing right across the middle of there in quote, Community Drive, in quote, right where the GPS coordinates told us our line actually sat. Victoria came screaming out of her house in a Mercedes, her face a shade of red. I didn't end Oppos. T think was biologically possible. Stop this right now. I'm calling the sheriff. You're destroying private property, she shrieked, her voice cracking as she stood on her perfectly edged sidewalk. I just leaned on my shovel and waited for the sheriff to pull up. Sheriff Miller, a man who'd known my father and knew the law inside and out. When Miller got out of his cruiser, Victoria launched into a tirade about, in quote, domestic terrorism, in quote, and in quote, lawless ranchers, in quote, waving her HOA bylaws around like they were the Ten Commandments. I didn't end Oppos. T say a word. I just handed the sheriff the certified folder from the archives, the original 1952 Homestead Act, the 1986 Clerical Error Report, and a fresh survey stamped by the State Board. Miller put on his glasses, read for about 3 minutes, and then looked up at Victoria with a look that was half pity and half satisfaction. Ma'am, he said, tipping his hat, I suggest you step back, because according to the state of Texas, you're currently standing on Mr. Blackwood's front porch, and he's well within his rights to fence it off. You could have heard a butterfly sneeze in that moment. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. That's impossible, she stammered. We have a title. We have a corporation. I looked her dead in the eye and said, Victoria, you can't have an HOA for a community that's built on stolen dirt. Your title is and Oppos. Defective and Oppos. Your insurance is void as of 10 minutes ago, and since your HOA's legal charter requires you to own the common areas you manage, your organization just ceased to exist. The fallout was like a slow-motion car crash. Within 24 hours, the news had hit the subdivision, and the homeowners, people who had paid millions for their, in quote, exclusive, in quote, lifestyle, realized their houses were built on a legal graveyard. They weren't in Oppos. T mad at me, though. They were furious at Victoria and the developer for the massive fraud they'd stepped into. The HOA board dissolved in a flurry of resignations and lawsuits as everyone tried to distance themselves from the disaster. Bradley, the developer, tried to file for a quick bankruptcy to hide his assets, but the county prosecutor was already breathing down his neck for title fraud. But I was in Oppos, T done. I didn't in Oppos. T want their houses, I just wanted my peace. We sat down with the reasonable folks in the neighborhood, the ones who Victoria hadn't in Oppos. T managed to brainwash, and we worked out a deal. I gave them a, in quote, quiet title, in quote, so they wooed into Oppos. T lose their homes, but in exchange, the Highlands was rezoned as a secondary agricultural buffer. No more fines, no more complaints about the smell of hay, and no more gated entrance blocking my ranch. Victoria? She had to sell her house for pennies on the dollar just to cover her legal fees from the homeowners in Oppos. Class action suit. Last I heard, she was living in a rental condo 2 towns over, probably complaining to the landlord about the color of the mulch. It's quiet on the ridge again now. The stars are back, and Silas and I can work in the barn without a, in quote, violation notice, in quote, taped to the door. We even turned the old HOA clubhouse, the one they built on our land, into a community center for the local 4-H club and a vet clinic for the county. It's funny how people think they can use a little bit of power to erase 70 years of history. But the land has a way of remembering who actually belongs to it. It makes you wonder, though, in a world where everyone's obsessed with, in quote, property values, in quote, and in quote, community standards, in quote, what's more important? The rules written on a piece of paper by a board of directors, or the roots you've planted in the dirt over 3 generations? I'm curious to know what you guys think. Was I too harsh in letting the whole HOA collapse? Or is that just the price you pay for trying to steal someone's heritage? Have you ever had a run-in with a neighbor who thought they owned the air you breathe? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your stories. And if you think justice was served at Blackwood Ridge, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the little guy or the guy with the oldest deed actually wins. I'll see you in the next one, hopefully from the porch of a place that's actually yours.